One of the world's most talented racing drivers just revealed something shocking about what it really takes to survive next to one of motorsport's greatest champions. And the answer is more brutal than you might think. 4 years. That's how long Sergio Perez endured what he's now calling an increasingly unforgiving mental battle at Red Bull Racing, the same team that's dominated Formula One for over a decade. But here's the thing that nobody's talking about. The way the organization handled his struggles along the way might actually be more interesting than his own internal fight. When you think of Red Bull Racing, you think of championships, victories, and Max Verstappen doing things in a car that shouldn't be physically possible. What you don't typically think about is the second driver sitting in the other Red Bull, wondering if they're losing their mind. Perez recently opened up on the High Performance podcast about something he's never fully detailed before, the psychological toll of being the number 2 driver in a team completely architected around one man. And the details he shared paint a picture of what it's really like when you're the supporting cast in someone else's championship dream. Let's start with the position itself, because this context is absolutely crucial. The second Red Bull seat isn't just another spot on the grid. It's essentially designed with one primary objective: help Max Verstappen win championships. Every system, every strategy, every resource is calibrated with that goal in mind. You're not hired to be a rival. You're hired to be a cooperative teammate who occasionally wins races but ultimately serves the larger mission. Perez himself has now acknowledged this reality, and what's remarkable is how explicitly he's described accepting it. He said something that really stood out. You cannot over-push the system too much because they just break you. That's a loaded statement, and it tells you something profound. Perez wasn't just competing against Verstappen on track, he was also managing a psychological minefield where the very act of pushing too hard against the established hierarchy could fundamentally damage his relationship with the team. It's a strange position to be in as a professional athlete. Most competitive drivers enter Formula One with the goal of winning championships themselves. Perez had to rewire that mentality and accept a supporting role while maintaining the mental resilience to compete at the highest level. That's not just tough, that's psychologically complex. During his time at Red Bull from 2021 through 2024, Perez experienced something that many second drivers at dominant teams face, but rarely discuss openly. The team was consistently behind him, at least officially. Christian Horner and Helmut Marko, the team leaders, would celebrate his victories, but there was always an underlying message. The project is built around Max. That wasn't subtle or hidden, it was the foundation of everything. Perez has said that he understood this and accepted it. But understanding and accepting something intellectually is entirely different from processing it emotionally, day after day, week after week, across 4 racing seasons. What makes his recent revelation particularly striking is something the team did whenever Perez struggled on track. Instead of a straightforward technical analysis, which is standard in modern motorsport, Red Bull would occasionally attribute his performance dips to psychological issues. Let that sink in for a moment. When you're underperforming, the last thing you need from your organization is the suggestion that the problem is in your head rather than something concrete and fixable like setup, tire management, or strategy. It creates this feedback loop where the driver starts questioning their own mental state, which ironically can actually create the very psychological issues that were initially suspected. This pattern repeated enough that Perez eventually made the decision to seek professional psychological help. And here's a critical detail. He didn't seek this help because he felt he needed it on his own terms. He sought it because the team suggested he do so. Perez was remarkably candid about this in his recent interview. He said they kept suggesting his on-track struggles were rooted in mental issues, and he thought maybe they were right. So he decided to try working with a psychologist, partly because he wanted to show the team he had the right attitude and was willing to do whatever it took to overcome the situation. In other words, the help he sought wasn't necessarily driven by his own diagnosis, but by organizational pressure and the desire to appear cooperative and mentally resilient to the people making decisions about his career. That's a nuanced situation that most viewers probably haven't considered. Perez was essentially saying,
I'll get help not because I believe I need it, but because I need to demonstrate to my team that I'm willing to do anything to improve. It's a form of psychological performativity that exists in elite competitive environments. He was managing not just his on-track performance, but his entire image as a committed professional willing to address whatever the team believed his issues were. What's also worth examining is the isolation Perez experienced within the organization. He mentioned explicitly that he was completely on his own at Red Bull in terms of management. Think about that for a second. You're at one of the world's most prestigious racing teams, surrounded by hundreds of talented staff members and engineers. Yet in terms of management support, you're essentially alone. Your teammate has the infrastructure, the backing, and the resources of the entire operation. You're getting what's left over. That's not a reflection of Red Bull's cruelty, it's just how dominant team structures work. But the isolation is real, and Perez has now publicly acknowledged that it made an already difficult situation significantly harder to navigate. The 4-year period he spent at Red Bull wasn't marked by dramatic failures or scandals. In many ways, Perez did exactly what the team needed him to do. He won races, he scored points, he helped Max Verstappen and Red Bull achieve their objectives. From a results perspective, you could call his stint successful. But the internal experience was apparently quite different from the external narrative. He's now saying that what allowed him to survive that long in that position wasn't necessarily tactical skill or raw speed, it was how he built his character and his ability to accept difficult circumstances. After stepping away from Red Bull at the end of 2024, Perez took a year away from Formula One. Now he's returned in 2026, but this time with Cadillac, a new team, a different environment, and presumably a different psychological dynamic. The contrast is notable. He's had the space to reflect on what that Red Bull experience really meant to him, and he's chosen to discuss it publicly in a way that's thoughtful, balanced, and notably free of bitterness. He's not blaming Red Bull for being a difficult place to work. He's acknowledging that the position was inherently challenging, and that the way the organization managed performance issues, including through psychological explanations, added another layer of complexity. This is where his story connects to something larger in professional sports. We're at a point where the best teams in any competitive field are becoming increasingly specialized around their star performers. That's just the nature of elite competition. But what happens to the supporting cast? How do organizations manage the psychological well-being of athletes who are genuinely talented but operating in a subordinate role? Perez's experience suggests that there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. What's particularly insightful is that Perez doesn't seem to be looking for sympathy or claiming he was mistreated. He's offering a realistic assessment. Red Bull was behind him to a certain point, but the project was always and fundamentally about Verstappen. That was clear. He accepted it, and he tried to make the best of it. The psychological support he sought, the suggestions about his mental state when he struggled, these weren't malicious. They were part of a system where performance is constantly analyzed and where psychological factors are increasingly recognized as legitimate variables in athletic success. The problem, as Perez seems to be suggesting, is that this focus on mental state can sometimes obscure the structural reality that he was operating in a system designed with inherent limitations. Since returning to Formula One with Cadillac, Perez is in a situation that's fundamentally different. Cadillac is a new entry into the sport, and for the first time in years, Perez isn't the second driver at a dominating team. He's part of a project that's still building. Whether this change in structure and role will impact his long-term success in the sport remains to be seen. But what we can say is that Perez has spent the time and taken the step to publicly process what 4 years in that second Red Bull seat actually meant to him. His willingness to discuss this openly without turning it into a dramatic blame game is actually what makes Sergio Perez's perspective so compelling. In a sport where emotions often run high and former drivers sometimes use interviews as opportunities to settle old scores, Perez has taken a very different approach. Rather than portraying himself as a victim or suggesting there was some grand conspiracy against him, he has chosen to describe the reality of the situation as he experienced it. That honesty gives his words far more weight than a sensational tell-all ever could. Perez is acknowledging something that many Formula One fans understand but rarely hear explained directly by the drivers themselves. Not every team environment is structured equally for every driver. Red Bull Racing was built around winning championships, and during Perez's time there, Max Verstappen was a driver consistently delivering results at a historic level. Naturally, the team's priorities, development direction, and long-term planning often revolved around maximizing the performance of the driver who was leading championship campaigns. That doesn't necessarily mean Perez was treated unfairly. In fact, by most accounts, the team remained professional and supportive. Engineers worked with him, resources were available, and the organization wanted him to perform well because a strong second driver benefits the entire team. But support and priority are not always the same thing. A driver can be respected and valued while still operating within a structure that isn't fundamentally centered around their success. That distinction is important because it highlights the psychological challenge Perez was facing every single weekend. Formula One drivers are among the most competitive athletes in the world. They arrive at the track believing they can beat anyone. That's the mindset required to reach the pinnacle of motorsport in the first place. Yet Perez found himself in a situation where he was expected to perform at an elite level while constantly being compared to a teammate who was not only winning races, but redefining expectations for consistency and dominance. For any athlete, that would be difficult. Imagine preparing for months, dedicating your entire life to improving by fractions of a second, only to see your performances measured against one of the greatest runs the sport has ever seen. Every mistake becomes magnified. Every disappointing qualifying session becomes a headline. Every strategic decision gets analyzed through the lens of comparison. Over time, that pressure accumulates. What makes Perez's comments so significant is that he's not pretending those pressures didn't exist. He's openly acknowledging the mental strain that comes from competing in an environment where the competitive structure is inherently asymmetrical. Not because anyone intentionally wanted him to fail, but because the realities of Formula One often create circumstances where one driver naturally becomes a focal point of a team's ambitions. Many athletes in similar situations struggle to talk about these realities. Some remain silent, others become defensive. A few lash out publicly. Perez has chosen a different path. He's describing the experience with nuance and perspective, recognizing both the opportunities he was given and the challenges he faced. That level of reflection is rare. What's even more impressive is that Perez managed to maintain his professionalism throughout the process. Despite intense media scrutiny, constant speculation about his future, and relentless criticism from a portion of the fan base, he consistently showed up, competing and fulfilling his responsibilities to the team. There were undoubtedly moments when frustration could have boiled over. There were opportunities to create controversy or generate headlines through criticism, yet he consistently avoided that route. Now, with the benefit of distance and hindsight, he's able to provide a clearer picture of what life inside that environment actually was like. And in doing so, he's helping to challenge a common misconception about elite sport. Fans often assume that if an athlete isn't winning, they simply aren't performing well enough. The reality is usually far more complicated. Performance is influenced by confidence, environment, team dynamics, expectations, and psychological resilience. Even the most talented competitors can struggle when those factors become overwhelming. Perez's experience serves as a reminder that elite performance isn't just about physical ability or technical skill. It's also about managing your mindset under extraordinary pressure. In Formula One, where hundreds of a second can determine careers, the mental side of competition can be just as important as anything happening on track. His comments may also resonate beyond motorsport. Many people have experienced situations where they were working within organizations that valued them but weren't fundamentally built around their success. Navigating that reality requires emotional intelligence, resilience, and self-awareness.